Welcome everyone to today's Flex webinar, where we're going to be talking about pricing models. I am your host, Marcus Merritt. So in Flex, there are three kinds of price calculations that can be done as part of a pricing model, okay? The two that are fairly basic and in everyone's system is as entered and as a multiple of another pricing model, okay? The complicated one that we're going to spend most of our time today on is tiered. Okay. First, I just want to highlight really quick, in everyone's system by default, you should see a day rate system that is an as entered. It just has field where you can just type in what it is for the cost, what do you want for the price. You type it in, that's what it's going to be. Or the week rate, where it by default is 3 times the day rate. So it's that multiplier of another price. Whatever you put for the day rate, it multiplies that by 3 if week rate is what you choose. Okay, those are those pretty straightforward, pretty simple examples. I'll highlight the couple settings that are referencing those when we get to the settings page, but just note they're in everyone's system and they're fairly straightforward. Okay, so right here, and I'll show how to get this in a minute, but I want to just highlight a few things first. So we would get to this page by going to System Settings, Pricing Models, and then opening a pricing model or adding a new one. We see here that this is the settings for week rate, okay? So first I want to highlight this section in the top right, where this is resource types. This is where you select which resource types can have this pricing model. I highlight this for two specific reasons. One, it's very common when people decide to add a new resource type, specifically like a new service, that they're like, I can't get the pricing model that I want. And it's because you have to go to that pricing model and allow that new resource type. You can't do that from the resource type menu. You have to come into the pricing model. The other is that under that menu, there is a save button, and that save button only affects that section of the menu. Everything else live saves when you change it. That is the only thing where you have to hit that save after you've changed your selection. I believe we're going to make this a cleaner, more intuitive menu in Flex 5 when we get this built, but I can't guarantee anything. Right now, this still has to be done in Flex 4. Okay. So now, talking about the rest of this menu, over on the top left, this is just the naming and baseline settings of this. Okay. The name of it, which is how it's going to show up in the rate column when it's put on a quote or any other financial document. Code, which can be used for reporting purposes but is not required. Units of measure of what it's going to be looking at. Now, the super important thing here is in the default settings, you have a quantity column and a time column. Commonly, people like to replace and think of that time column as a multiplier column. But the key is Flex thinks of it as time. So if you want that column to be able to be anything but 1, you must pick a unit of measure that is a unit of time, hour, day, week. You can't pick something else and have that multiplier column do anything. So even if you choose to try to make one that's maybe more about miles for trucking, if you want to say one truck went miles, you still have to tell the units of measure to be a time measurement, even though you then override that and tell it, well, it was 100 miles, and you name it something for miles or kilometers. You have to still pick a unit of measurement because Flex thinks of that column as a unit of time. Okay. Count unit, similar to that, but again, count unit, most of the time none. If you pick something else that's different, you can. The effective and expiration dates are about setting limited time frames. Very rarely are they used, but you could set, a special rate for a special time of year, and then you would have to keep kind of resetting that. And that disabled by default, unfortunately, it does not work and probably will be depreciated and removed from Flex when it gets to move to Flex 5. So then our main menu of these is in the bottom section. Now, the key thing here is everything above the line I added in the middle of that box is the same. We just have the settings for the cost and the settings for the price, okay? Cost being your internal cost, your burden cost, whatever you may do, and then the price being what you're charging to your customer, okay? We see they're all of the same settings across there. And the key for this means they can be the same and are commonly the same setting, both as entered are, in the day rate example, both of them are as entered. In the week rate, they're both as a multiple of another pricing model, but they do not have to be the same. Sometimes I've seen people examples where the cost, they've taken the effort to try to calculate what it costs them to get that item out the door and to put it away. That's what they want to choose as their cost. And so sending this item out for a week versus a day doesn't actually increase their cost. And so they may want the cost calculation either to say, well, I'm still using it as a multiple, but it's 1 times the day rate, not 3 times the day rate. Or they set it to be as entered, so it's still just a manual field, while the price calculation could be it's not super common, but it is nice that it has that availability for you to make those things slightly different. Okay. The examples I'm going to use later today, I'm going to be ignoring the cost because all of the settings are otherwise the same. And so we're just going to focus on price to keep things a little simpler that way. Okay. And then the other thing I want to highlight here is the items below the line are either A, the very complicated settings where it's easier for me to explain when to turn them yes and no rather than to fully explain how they work. There's also that time is cost and time is price. They're matched. They're just not in a position where it's easy to put the line. So I just kind of generally say gloss over those and I'll show you where to use them and it makes sense. Again, most of this, it's easier to explain in the scenarios rather than try to explain how all of them, some of them, their verbiage, their wording is not the best, and we're going to hope to improve that in the future. The next thing I want to get to is we're mostly going to talk about tiered pricing. So I'm going to get into the details, and we're not going to talk about the specifics of these settings, right? We'll talk about that when I get into the specific tiers. But what I want to highlight here is when you're adding a tier to something, there is a left side and a right side menu, and it's important to think of that delineation between them. The left side menu is the matching criteria. This is saying, this is all about figuring out, in this situation, is this tier applicable? Does this one match the current information of how many days or how many hours or what setting? And then if it does, the formula on the right side tells it, well, now this is how much price or cost should be added to this item because this has been applied. Okay, that's that key thing, is just to make sure when we think of it being kind of complicated, make sure to think of there's a left side about does this item match, and then the right side about, okay, now that it matches, what do we do with it? If it doesn't match, the right side doesn't matter because we're not going to even use it, so it's not going to be used. Okay. Let's go ahead and go live now. Again, unfortunately, most of the tiered pricing works in Flex 5, but there's a little bit that doesn't, and all of the settings are in Flex 4. So for today, everything's going to be in Flex 4. As the reminder, to get to this, we're in System Settings, and then Pricing Models. That will take us to this page where you see I've added a few additional pricing models from kind of the defaults that are in a system. Okay. And first, what we're going to talk about is this one that I've called rental rate. Okay. So again, very common. Most people are just using the day rate. They're saying, hey, we're renting it out for 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, whatever. But some people would instead rather have it to be tiered depending on how long that rental is, especially people that are more just rental houses and not production houses. It's more on, you said you're picking it up this day and you're going to bring it back 7 days from now, 12 days from now, whatever that is. And we have a structure for how much you get charged for each day it goes out. And that it gets charged, more each day, but it's less percentage of the kind of base cost each day. Okay? So this is going to be an example to kind of show that. And in there's 2 or 3 different ways that people commonly do this. And I've built this one to kind of highlight all of those options. Okay? So first, I just want to highlight the settings here in the top where so first over here, we've just called it rental rate, and we've said we're measuring days. Okay, and we've ignored all of these other settings. We don't want to put any limits on that. Again, I've talked about I'm going to ignore the cost. We're going to focus just on the price. Okay, for the resource type, I went in here and made sure it was for rental items and hit save. Okay, we set it to be a tiered calculation versus as entered or as multiple. Okay, because we're not doing the multiplier, we are grayed out here. Now, there are some other things in these tiered minimums or maximums, and we're not going to mess with those. I'm not a big fan. I like using the full tiered selection in there. we can set to be able to do manual pricing tiers, but again, that's kind of a complication we're going to ignore today. Okay. And then the other key thing is, as far as those items down at the bottom that were a little more complicated, we're just going to leave this as saying no, no, no. We're going to leave all of this off. Okay. And the only key thing in here that I want to highlight that's common is most people's default pricing models are set to say price override enabled. And that just says once it's in there, your salesperson or your management person has the ability to override and change that price. And so that's just a completely up to you whether you want to have that. It's not a complicated, it's just, do you want it to be changeable or do you not want it to be changeable? Okay. So we're going to now minimize this and focus on the tiers here. Now, again, yours is going to start as being blank, and to save time, I went ahead and pre-created. When you go to add them, you just go to this add here in the top right, or it would be the middle right if you didn't collapse that. And this is going to get you the tiers menu that I highlighted again. Our left side is our matching, our right side is our formula once we have matched. But what I'm going to do instead is pop open our first tier and highlight the settings on this. So here, I've named it day one. I'm saying because this is again about our being set to be able to figure out how much we want to charge, whether it's one day to lots of days, and that doesn't add up in the same way. It's not just times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5, times 6, but it slowly gets cheaper per day, but still is overall charging more for those longer rentals. Okay. So on here, we've said this is day one. Now we're focusing on our matching criteria. The summary builds itself based on these settings. So you don't have to be concerned with that other than you can glance at it and kind of learn what it means. Okay. I've decided basically to skip all of these things. We don't need any special settings here. We're not going to limit what days of the week it could be affected for, or times. Those are much more about labor, and we will get to that later. We're not going to let quantities of these items. If I was renting out one of these versus 10 of these, I don't care. That's not going to change my price. So these counts are not going to be in here. So we're just focused on this time unit. Okay. Now, technically, you don't have to set this time unit, but I tend to like to just kind of keep myself, make sure I'm thinking and communicating straight. But we actually set the day, the time unit in the main pricing model, and that does override. So in here, we've set this to say our start effective time quantity is 0 and our end is 7. And this is one of those things I commonly explain because it's a little more confusing. The start effective time quantity is a greater than calculation. We're saying we start when we are greater than this number. Technically, we don't have to have that be 0. It could be blank. That's the same thing. So the thing is, it's when it goes larger than that number, it starts to take effect. Okay. It ends taking effect when it is greater than this number. Okay. This one will continue to take effect anytime that it is less than or equal to. Okay. And that's the one thing here is our summary is slightly wrong. It should have an or equal to. Okay. So when our time is greater than 0 and less than or equal to 7, this will apply. And we've said that our time is our days. Okay. How many days? Okay. That's what we're going to be using in our time field. Once we've then decided that this applies, we're then going to have the formula of what do we do with it. Okay. Now, this is important because I said this is just day one, but I want this to apply in day 0 through day 7. Okay. And I will show you why. There's a key thing on that. So what I've done is I've said, well, it's going to apply the base pricing model of the day rate. Okay. We have a day rate in case we're using the regular as entered system. And I still just want to multiply it by 1 because I'm just trying to charge one day rate for the first day. Again, I'm skipping all this middle section because we're not doing anything with count, okay? And so we're coming back down here to our time unit and then our offset minimum and maximum, okay? This is where when we have, and we'll show on the times offset on the next tier, how we use that. The minimum, again, is much more commonly used in a labor situation where you're trying to say, hey, this guy is on a 4-hour minimum. But our maximum here is saying, even when this is 2 days or 3 days, which it still applies, I'm only want to actually charge for day one time, okay? That's the key what this is. I've maxed myself at charging for day one time. And what this is because what we've built this, I'm just going to go ahead and hit save, is I've built it so that day 1 through day 7 pile on top of each other. So we charge for day 1, and then when we add another day, we'll also charge for day 2 and day 3, and then adding and adding. So we can add up to all 4 of these tiers together to add to the price rather than just moving to a new tier, okay? And we'll demonstrate that in a second. I want to gloss over a few of these, but they're really similar. Again, we're saying this is meant to be for day 2 and 3. We're skipping all of that. We're starting when we get higher than 1, and we're still saying we apply up until 7, okay? Now we're saying that on day 2 and day 3, we want to charge 0.5 or half of the day rate, okay? And we charge half for day 2, half for day 3. But then here, we're saying this applies, but once it applies, it looks at the whole structure and then says, oh, well, I've seen you've set it for 2 days, I mean, for 2 hours, 2 days, so you should then be charged twice. And we have to say, yeah, but we already charged for the first day in another tier. So that's why we set this -1 to say, don't recharge for the first day. We took care of that in another tier, okay? And then, because this is saying we're only up to day 3, we want to cap this at 3, okay? Which means in our math with our 3 and our -1, we can only charge for 2 days in this pricing model, which again is day 2 and day 3, okay? We're going to do the same thing basically in day 4 and day 5, where we've just pushed ourselves up to 3. We've gone down to 0.25%, a quarter of the day rate, and then we're 3 and 5 is our max. So again, we have the ability to charge for 2 days, but we're charging for the 4th and 5th day on this. And then for 6 and 7, now the one quirk I want to show here is you can type into here 3 digits of multiplier. So I initially built this as 0.125. When you reload it, it will round that back down to 2, but it initially actually knows that information. And so as long as I save it with the 3, it does keep that information. It's a little quirky where it's trying to force it to 2, but it doesn't actually, so you can go to 3 decimal points. And again, I've done the same thing. Don't start until after 5, be done at 7. Don't charge for the first 5 and be done at 7, okay? So now let's demonstrate how that works. So the nice thing here is you have this drop resource box here to be able to test your items. Now we can test them in an actual quote in a minute, but I like to a lot of times just use the kind of demo guy here to test it. So I'm going to grab my speaker here and I'm going to drag it into that, and it's going to pull up our pricing tier calculator, okay? And so it shows all my tiers, and we've not talked about these other 3 yet. We're just talking about the first ones. So I only want to talk about those. So we're going to say that if I'm renting 1 speaker, now that's not common, but we're just doing this to keep the math simple, and it's for 1 day, you'll see that it says 1 speaker, 1 day, the day rate is $100, our grand total is $100, okay? If we then go to 2, we see that we've kept this $100, but we've now added this second tier of 1 speaker for 1 day of 50, bringing us to 150. Charge 1 full day first day, charged a half a day on the second day. That's the same again on 3, where we add a second one of these, bringing us to 200. 4, bringing us to another 225 because we've added this third tier. 5, second of that third tier. 6, and 7. And you see in all of this, we're just slightly adding days and adding tiers, but it's continuing to apply all of these. We're just piling on top of each other, getting ourselves up to this, okay? And again, the specifics of what these examples are don't matter. You can figure out what's the pricing rate for your system, for your company, or maybe it's already knows and you're just trying to make it work in Flex. That's all fine. I'm just using an example to kind of show how this works. So that's what the comment on that is, the first thing is this is what I can pile tier on top of tier on top of tier to just add additional cost, okay? The second thing is instead where I want to, as we move through time, I want to shift tiers, okay? I want to jump down tiers. So let's close this for a second and look at that. So now on this, what I've set for week 2, we're saying, and on all of the other ones, we said end our effective time at 7. But now we've said start when we go over 7 and end at 14. Okay, so that's all of the days in week 2, day 8 through day 14. Okay, and we've said we're still going to base it on the day rate, but what we've said is for a 2-week rental, we just want to make it an even 5 times the day rate. So we've just made the multiplier 5. But then, because whether it's 8 days or 14 days, we're charging 2 weeks or 5-day rates, I've made my maximum time quantity 1. I've just said, once this applies, charge it once. And so whether it's 8 days, 9 days, 10 days, 14 days, doesn't matter, we're going to charge this one time, okay? In the same way, on this week 3, we've just said, when we go over 14 and up to 21, we now want to charge 8-day rates, and we just want to do that one time again, okay? So in here, I'm just going to mow those. So we're going to throw it back in here, and we're going to start. When we test these, I really like to test at breakpoint. So, I like to just kind of kick out, is it working right at 1? Okay, well, let's jump it up to 7, the end of our stacking our 4 tiers. Okay, yes, all 4 of our tiers was working. That's all fine. Okay, well, now let's jump to 8, and we'll see that all of those go away. We're saying we don't charge any of these anymore. Now we just charge this one, our 5-day rates, okay? And then that's the same all the way up to 14. Well, let's do one in the middle. Let's hit 10. We see that nothing changed. And then 14, again, nothing has changed. But then if we go to 15, we start into that 3rd week, we stop using this week and we move down to this week. And that again is all about our matching criteria. In all of these first 4, we said they match up to 7 and they gradually match at 0, 1, 3, 5, whatever. But then these we've said only from 7 to 14 and only this tier from 14 to 21, okay? Now, the key in this is on our week 3, we've still said this is only for week 3, which ends our effective at 21. And so the problem in doing this on a long-term rental is you either have to A, decide there is a point at which you will never rent for longer than a certain time frame, or you have to have a tier that does not have an end effective time quantity. There's a couple different ways you could do that, but I'm just going to show this. So I have one more that I said as 4+, okay? So now I've said we start this at over 21 days and we never end it. Now, sometimes you could say, well, what we do there is we go to 10 times the day rate and charge it once. And so whether it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 100 weeks, we charge the same price. I mean, I think if it was really, really long, you'd, do some extra adjustments. But in this one instead, what we've done is we said, I'm going to go backwards and we're going to do a calculation for what it costs each day to make it so on that 22nd day, it's a little more expensive. And then it just keeps getting more expensive every day that it's longer because I really don't want my gear to be out that long. So in this, and again, I actually made it 0.375 in here, and I set no minimum or maximum or offset because I've said we're now going to switch to basically charging this smaller percentage, but for every single day, meaning starting back from day 1 up till day 22 and on, we're charging this smaller percentage of that original day rate, okay? So again, just in our example, we're going to throw this guy in here. We're going to have 1 for 1. We're going to jump ourselves to 7, up to 14, where we drop all of those and add this one, up to 21. We move to the next tier. And then at 22, we'll see that we jump into this tier where we said, oh, we have one of these speakers and we're charging for 22 days at $37.50. Meaning it gets us to $825, but now if it's a 30-day rental or 32-day rental, Well, now it's $1,200. And like I said, the only negative on this, and it's just a decision of what you choose to do, if they suddenly say, well, we want to rent it for 150 days, well, that's more than that speaker costs. So that might be a hard argument to make, but that's just up to you on how your model. So that's the key I just want to state. You can either do tiers that continue to stack on top of each other. You can do tiers where it moves from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, etc. You can do one that is more about just a growing small number, and potentially people commonly in this will say when it's in the shorter time, the amount per day is 0.5, and then later it goes to 0.25, and then later it goes to something else. Kind of it just gets longer that way, but sometimes but it still says I'm charging for every day, I'm not stacking. So those are kind of the common different ones when we're just thinking of rental items, and they're usually then on a reference of our day rate or our base rate, okay? So again, if we have questions, we'll get to those at the end. So the next here is I want to talk about a simple option for labor, okay? This is I'm still just going to state how many hours I'm intending this person to work. I'm not having it actually calculate time for me, but I want it to, after a certain point, move into figuring overtime rather than me having to make two separate lines for straight time and for overtime, okay? So what we've done here is I've just called this hourly with OT. Our unit of measure is hour, which again has to be a unit of time. Over here, we've made this apply to labor from our service section and saved that. Again, I'm ignoring cost calculations and just focusing on the price calculations where I've set tiered. And again, very similar to the other one, though I'm doing hour instead of day, I'm not doing the complication of calculating time or time slicing. So I've set all of this at none. You could turn on the manual pricing tiers or the price override. That doesn't really matter in our current example, okay? So still pretty simple, still leaving all of these at none. What I've done here, and again, it's very straightforward, and I'm just doing what's a fairly common kind of industry freelance thing, especially I guess in America. I know it's going a little more away from that with changes of labor laws, but just a very common thing where people are saying, okay, I or a 4-hour minimum. Generally, my full day is 10 hours, and over 10 hours, I charge you overtime. Okay? So for our straight time calculation, I've chosen to say, again, this is the same for these guys, really forgiving. He knows he commonly has to work weekends, so he just charges the same thing on weekend, same day of the, if it's early or late, he doesn't care. He's real good about that. So he's using the time limit of hour, and we just have chosen to set, though not required, that we would never book for somebody more than a 20-hour shift, okay? So if for some reason you put 21 hours, it's gonna go, I don't know what to do with this, and flag that you've booked somebody for a little too long of a shift. That is not really required, but that's what I've chosen to do in this case. So it's pretty straightforward if this is going to apply almost anything you put in here, okay? The next is, now that we've done that, what are we going to do? We see this one is quite a bit more complicated. So we've said we're going to base this on our hourly rate. We're going to still multiply that by 1, okay? Pretty straightforward math. We're skipping all of our count section, doing our hour. But the first is we've said that if you book a guy for a short call, he still gets a minimum of 4 hours. So we've said anytime you book this guy, he's going to get to 4 hours no matter what. And then we've said at straight time, we cap ourselves at 10, okay? So we stop adding at 10. We still apply this at more than 10 in the same way where we were stacking tiers in the previous example, but we're only charging straight time up to 10, okay, in this example. So very similar to that one, other than we've added our minimum in here. That's really the biggest change we've made from the other one, and we've changed, okay? Then on our overtime, we've just said now, once we go over 10 and we're still stopping ourselves at 20, then we're going to do our 1.5 hourly rate. And we've set our negative 10 to say, don't recharge for the first 10. We did that in the other tier, and then just continue charging that 1.5 up until we've hit our 20, okay? Fairly simple, fairly straightforward, but can be nice to make sure that, and because generally it's that time when you say, I'm expecting to book somebody for a 12, 14, or 16-hour shift, something like that. A little long, but not ridiculous. We're gonna get a little bit of overtime in here. So Again, we're going to example here. I'm going to go get the audio engineer position. Now we see the moment I drop this in, before I've set any information, you see that already it said 1 at 4, because anytime this guy shows up, he's going to get that 4-hour minimum. So before I even set anything, it's already telling me the assumption is we're going to have at least one of these guys with a 4-hour minimum, which is going to cost us $200 because we've set his hourly rate at 50. Okay. Again, this one is meant to be where you're not going to calculate time. You're still just typing your expected shift. You're expecting the guy to work, 8 hours, right? And so then you'll just see that this says, oh, well, then I'm going to work him 8 hours, right? I'm expecting him to work 10 hours. Okay. Oh, that's his full day. We're expecting him to work 11 hours. Oh, well, now he gets 1 hour of overtime. And then continuing up, let's see if that just adds. We'll jump up to 16, up to 20. And then, like I said, the key thing here is I have made this so if for some reason you were like, I'm going to work this guy 21 hours, it suddenly goes, well, neither of these apply. So now he's free. Like I said, you could choose to not make that, or most likely you would feel safe at knowing I'm not going to book the guy for more than 20 hours. Hopefully I'm not booking him that long most of the time. Okay. So fairly straightforward, but commonly people go, I don't want to deal with the call times, but I do want some overtime to be tracked when I choose to have the guy on a 12-hour shift. And so, hey, it throws in there those overtime hours automatically for you. Okay, brings us to our 650 here. Okay, but otherwise pretty simple and straightforward. So now we're going to get to the complicated one, which can be done for other personal, but what I find is the most is people are doing this to match union prices where venues they know they're going to have to deal with, a local or a IBEW, something like that. Okay. For this is where we're going to get all those other complicated settings in here. Again, at the beginning, though, we're still measuring hours. We're not setting specific dates. We're ignoring cost. We've set this to be on labor. Again, and the key thing here is because we want to do this where it's actually figuring based on the hours of the day, we're going to be using call times, and we have to calculate time and time slice. Okay. The key thing in that is basically calculate time says ignore the default time information that's going to add that to the time column in your sheet, in your financial document, and instead look at the call time information and calculate how much that is, okay? And then time slicing is what says, I'm going to take that calculated time and I'm going to break it up into the appropriate tiers and assign them correctly, okay? That's how that works. That's the simplest explanation on it, how it does it's duplicated, okay? So for here, what I'm going to do is just start with our straight time hours, okay? So the first is we're starting to use some of these other settings we weren't using before, okay? We're saying that this straight time only applies on normal days, okay? Weekdays, okay? Doesn't apply on weekends, doesn't apply on holidays. They get paid extra if they work on those days. Also, we're having the time of day effect. Very commonly for those kind of things, there's after hours or early/late hours that people can be. So we're saying this only starts at 7 a.m. If they're booked before 7 a.m., it's different. And it stops at midnight, okay? Between 7 a.m. and midnight on regular weekdays, that's where straight time is applicable, okay? And then again here, we've set this to say that this one should stop at 8. Now, the one thing I'll say that's a little complicated on this for people is on the other examples, I said, hey, don't stop until higher. But once we time slice, it knows to apply every tier that should be applicable. And so we keep it smarter in the time slicing by telling it here. And it's a little bit convoluted that way, but that is proper work, okay? So now that we've made it apply, we've said when we have our, again, hourly rate of 1, we're going to use our hour, and fairly similar to what we did in the last, we're saying they get a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 8 straight time hours, okay? That's where we cap off there, okay? Now for our overtime, we're doing basically the thing, we're saying normal, 7 to midnight, but we don't start this until over 8, and these end at 12. we're going to charge 1.5, and we're offsetting. We're not recharging for those first 8, and we would charge up to 12 hours worth, meaning a total of 4 hours of overtime can be applied. Okay? In our double time, doing the same thing. Normal weekdays, 7 to midnight, after 12, and we're not stopping on this. Double, don't charge for the first 12, no endpoint. Okay, so we're going to stop there and analyze that for a second. We're going to use our example for a minute. I'm going to show this in a quote in just a second because it does display better once we get to all of it, but I want to show it here first. So in this, again, we start off already making that assumption because we set that 4-hour minimum. Let's shrink this down a little so we can all see that it's going to automatically apply that. But instead of going in here and setting a time quantity, I'm going to set a count, but then I have to actually go in here and set times that the call time would be set for. So we're going to say that this is tomorrow, okay? So it's a weekday, okay? We're going to start this call at 8 a.m. and then we're going to say it goes till tomorrow at, let's just straightforward. Let's start at 5 p.m. Let's do 4. Recalculate. So we see I didn't put anything in the time quantity because we're actually now calculating the time based on our call time set here. So I have it set from 8 to 4. Now the one thing to note is I'm not building this to include meal breaks. It adds a little level of complication that's not good for our time constraint. It's very doable. There's good other webinars to kind of help show that. I just want to highlight is this is, you know, you're on a crunch schedule, and so you have to feed them on the clock. Okay. So we're saying we're 8 hours there, and again, we jumped ourselves up to the 8 because that's what we were. Now when we kick ourselves to 5 p.m., it now goes, oh, we went into 1 hour of OT. That would be the same when we kick ourselves up to 9. Oh, sorry, my math is bad. To 8. So now we're up to our 4 hours of overtime. And then as we go higher, I'm going to go all the way up to 11. And that's going to get us 3 hours of double time. Actually push ourselves to midnight. It's just a little annoying because we have to do it as this way. And because we haven't crossed midnight, we're still dealing only with this normal. Everything still here is considered Friday. And so we've just been adding. We're doing 8 here, 4 here, 4 here. Okay. Now we add that complication when we're going to get into the after hours or onto a weekend time frame. Okay. So we're going to talk about these 2 tiers, and then we'll go into the actual quote and demonstrate them in there. So on this is saying for after hours, okay, this is still for normal days. This isn't weekend or holiday, but it's the reverse schedule. This is on a weekday, but if they work sometime between midnight and 7 a.m., okay? And then in this, we're not end effective on here. Doesn't really match the other. And we have our hourly rate at 2. Part of it is because we can only get 7 and it's already at our double time. So it doesn't really matter to put a limit on these. But again, this is the thing on kind of a union rule, if we called the guys at midnight to start working, they still get a 4-hour minimum. That's still part of their rules. So we say we have to get a 4-hour minimum. Now, I will show you that you'd worry that, well, what if I started them at 10? Is it going to give them 4 hours of straight time and 4 hours of after hours time? And it doesn't. It knows how to calculate the total amount of minimum hours and make sure it only does that. So we're going to go to that example in a minute. Okay, so that's our example here. We've just basically swapped our time frames and we've restated our minimum and doubled our time. And then the same on weekend, except on weekend we said it's only for weekend holidays, not normal. And I don't care what time of day because our rate is double. So if it's middle of the night, but it's on Saturday, who cares? It's the same price. So it doesn't matter the time. And then again, the same thing where we've set there is a minimum of 4 hours. Because we're already at double, it doesn't matter how long it gets because it can't become double-double. That's the largest it will be is double rate, okay? So now we're going to go into our actual pricing models example here and this, okay? So I'm going to just do some switched examples here. we're going to go back to our first example of starting at 8 a.m. And note, and this works different in Flex 5, and in my opinion, it's a lot cleaner, but to kick it down to 1 day in Flex 4, you can click that hyphen and it will swing how many days. And we're going to again say that this is going up to 4 p.m. And you'll see once that does, it then recalculates the time and said, oh, well, that's 8 hours of straight time. Okay. We can then switch ourselves up to going late. I'm just going to jump it quite late to move forward all the way to, oh, we have now 14 total hours, 8 at straight, 4 at overtime, 2 of double time. Okay. Now, though, we're going to start getting into those after hours ones. So the first, what we're going to do is we're going to still say that this is Friday. So we're not on the weekend, but we're going to start at 5 a.m. And we're going to go only until 3 p.m. But you'll see what it does here is it starts by saying, oh, well, they get 2 hours of after hours price, which is double rate. They get 2 of that. Then they move into regular straight time because now it's the applicable straight time. So they get that. But at 6, they've now worked a total of 8 hours, even though some were in after hours, which means they move into overtime rate. Okay. And that is the proper way for it to work. Okay. So they get 2 hours of that after hours. That's part of the time slicing of figuring the first 2 hours are those after hours. This means, oh, we've now got a total of 8. Only 6 apply to here because 2 were in this tier, but we can now apply, we're hitting our max and so move to a new tier. Okay. And then similarly, if we instead kick this to be into, oh, come on, don't fight me. Kick this to say we're going to go over into Saturday there. So we're going to say, oh, this is going to be for the late night strike. And we're going to go until 2 a.m. And we're only calling this guy starting at 11 p.m. So one thing to note here is we're only starting at a 3-hour call. But the system says, oh, well, he gets a 4-hour minimum. 1 hour was planned to be worked before it turned into weekend. And then it turned into weekend and he gets 3 hours, even though you only booked him for 3. Now, if we booked him starting at 10, it's going to update us to be in 2 and 2. But you see that even though both of these have a 4-hour minimum, it understands that we have 4 hours total. It's just 2 of this tier and 2 of this tier. Okay. And then obviously, if we moved forward into, you know, the whole thing was on Saturday, we just said we're doing the whole bit of work on Saturday because it's the weekend time. It now just sets it that everything is on the weekend and holiday, which is at our double time, and it just is the 1 straight here. Okay. So we can see how using these pricing tiers can help Flex to calculate these things and to put more complicated pricing rules without you having to do the manual effort. They are fairly complicated to get set up, but once they are set up, they can provide a lot of value for that.